The death of Jonathan Edwards is a story that hasn't been told as much as it should be. Of course, we think of his life, we think of his writings. If we think of anything about Jonathan Edwards, we think about his role in the revival, perhaps even his preaching of sinners in the hands of an angry God. But as interesting as his life is, his death is also very, very interesting as well. Thanks for checking into this video. My name is Matthew. I'm one of the pastors here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed, Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're interested in a church like that, we'd love to have you come visit us at some point. Please come check us out in real life. Well, let me tell you the story of the death of Jonathan Edwards. I think you're going to find that it is very thrilling and indeed very fascinating. There's some theological implications as well as some practical implications for us as well. So Jonathan Edwards, of course, his dates of life are 1703 to 1758, and he is somebody that we could truly say thought about death a lot. In fact, he was, as George Marsden, one of his biographers, says, constantly preparing to die. It's a major theme and motif in what Edwards taught and what he believed and the way he preached. In fact, we may think of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God as a sermon about hell. In fact, it's actually a sermon about the possibility of sudden death at any moment. And Edwards would constantly warn his family and his congregation about the possibilities of sudden death. For instance, listen to this letter that he writes to Timothy, his son. Now, his son Timothy is 14 years old at this point. He has gone off for studies of his own, and Timothy is sick, and the fear is that he may have contracted smallpox, which of course was a fatal disease in those days. Edwards writes a very moving and poignant letter to young Timothy. He says, "Before you receive this letter, the matter will doubtless be determined as to your having the smallpox. You will either be sick with that distemper or will be past the danger of having it from any infection taken in your voyage. But whether you are sick or well, like to die or like to live, I hope that you are earnestly seeking your salvation. I'm sure there's a great deal of reason it should be so, considering the warnings you have had in word and in providence." It's a moving letter, and there's a lot more there to it, where he warns Timothy, look, if you have smallpox, the chances are that by the time you get this letter, you might already be dying. In fact, you're probably never going to see your friends again. Don't have them come visit you because it's a contagious disease, and you'd better be preparing your heart for the possibility, the real possibility of death. Edwards was constantly thinking about death. Not that it was a morbid obsession from him, but more so that in those days they had to constantly be vigilant about the possibilities of disease, of war, of a difficult winter, childbirth, death in childbirth, all kinds of things could happen. And so Edwards was constantly preaching to his congregation that they should be prepared for that eventuality. Now, as to himself, he expected to live at least long enough to finish up his masterpiece. He had a masterpiece that he was hoping to write out. It would have been his magnum opus. We think of course, his Freedom of the Will as perhaps maybe his best, or maybe Original Sin, or maybe The End for Which God Created the World, or maybe The Nature of True Virtue. He had a lot of great writings, but he had one called A History of the Work of Redemption, which he really hoped to be his magnum opus. It would have been something like a systematic theology rolled together with a biblical theology rolled together with a church history, and it would have been a unique work in its time. So jumping ahead to the end of his life here, we're thinking about the year 1757 to 1758. Of course, Edwards was not expecting to die, though he was ready for it at any given moment. But let me lay out the series of events that led to his death. Okay, first of all, his son-in-law, Aaron Burr Sr. Now, I know you're probably thinking of Aaron Burr Jr., who killed Alexander Hamilton in the duel. Actually, that's his son, Edwards' grandson. But Aaron Burr Sr., his son-in-law, who married Esther, his daughter, had died, and Edwards was going to take up his place and move to the presidency of the College of Princeton in Princeton, New Jersey. Edwards was going to have to remove from the Stockbridge Mission Station, and so Edwards takes up that call to the presidency. And so what happens in this year then is that Edwards leaves Stockbridge ahead of Sarah, his wife, and that necessitates him having to say kind of a tearful and mournful goodbye, because he's going to leave them back at the mission station while he goes ahead of them to Princeton, New Jersey to take up the presidency. Thankfully, Edwards did have two daughters who were already there. Esther, the now widow, is there, as well as Lucy, another of his daughters. And so Edwards, for a short time, lives in the president's hall himself, or the president's, I guess, mansion is probably the wrong word, but the president's lodging by himself. And so during this time, he at least has some free time, a little bit, as he's taking up this new presidency, to see his daughter again, as well as to spend some time with his grandchildren, who he'd not had much time heretofore to spend with. So he gets a little bit of free time to spend with Sally, who's 4 years old, and Aaron Burr Jr. That's the guy who killed Alexander Hamilton, the future vice president from that perspective, who's only 2 years old. Already there were hints about Aaron Burr Jr. that he had kind of a cantankerous personality, at least so Esther hints in some of the things that she leaves for us in terms of letters. Now, before Aaron Burr died, Edwards was already concerned about the possibility of smallpox, okay? This was kind of the thing that they were all terrified of in those days, a disease that they were just then beginning to understand, but was nevertheless killing a whole lot of people. So Edwards had written to Aaron Burr, who later he dies, obviously, if you can find a skillful, prudent physician under whose care you can put yourself, you would do well to take the smallpox by inoculation before you go to Europe, after properly preparing your body for it by physic and diets. Now, I'm not sure whether or not Aaron Burr took up that advice, but you can tell that Edwards is already thinking about the possibilities of the inoculation, which at that point was very, very new technology here in the 1750s. Now, Edwards, we should note, is one who did believe in science. He was one who was very interested in science. In fact, if you know Edwards' early life, if he didn't become a minister and a theologian, there was an indication that he would have wanted to go into the field of science. He had done some early writings on biology and nature and light and rainbows and other such things. He had a scientific mind. He was reading some of the works of Locke and Newton and others who were doing some groundbreaking work in those days. And so Edwards thinks that inoculation is a new technology that they should probably avail themselves of. And so in order to prevent smallpox in his own life and in his own family, Edwards confides in a doctor called William Shippen, who does in fact inoculate Jonathan Edwards, as well as Lucy and Esther, and probably Sally and Aaron as well. I'm not 100% sure about that, but the biography states that he had his family inoculated. So this is what happens. Unfortunately, in those days, inoculation being a new technology, Edwards is misdosed, and rather than preventing the disease of smallpox, he actually contracts the disease. And first, it's just started off with a few pustules in the top of his mouth, which they hoped to be nothing. But after a few more days, it became painfully obvious, no pun intended, that his mouth and his throat were about to close up to the point that Edwards could not eat or even swallow. And so eventually what happened is that Edwards dies of what we might think of today as a vaccine injury, and he basically starves to death and or asphyxiates from his inability to breathe and to swallow and to eat any food correctly. Now, here is the account from Dr. Shippen, who is the one who performed the inoculation. You're going to notice that it's a rather glowing account of Edwards' death, which ironically we might suspect from the doctor who inadvertently killed him, okay? Nothing like, I'm so sorry I messed up the batch or anything like that. But rather, Dr. Shippen simply speaks of how peacefully and serene Jonathan Edwards died. So let's listen to Dr. Shippen here. Never did any mortal man more fully and clearly evidence the sincerity of his professions by one continued universal calm and cheerful resignation and patient submission to the divine will through every stage of the disease than he. Not so much as one discontented expression, nor the least appearance of murmuring throughout the whole, and never did any person expire with more perfect freedom than from pain, not so much as one distorted hair, but in the most proper sense of the words, he really fell asleep. Death had certainly lost its sting as to him. So Dr. Shippen here describes the peacefulness with which Jonathan Edwards succumbs to his asphyxiation or starvation death. A painful, terrible way to die, by the way. Now, before Edwards was finally unable to speak, he did utter a few words to Lucy, his daughter, who almost immediately wrote them down, thank goodness. So this is what we have of Jonathan Edwards' last words. So Edwards speaking to Lucy here, he says, "Dear Lucy, it seems to me to be the will of God that I must shortly leave you. Therefore, give my kindest love to my dear wife, and tell her that the uncommon union, which has so long subsisted between us, has been of such a nature as I trust is spiritual, and therefore will continue forever. And I hope she will be supported under so great a trial, and submit cheerfully to the will of God. And as to my children, you are now like to be left fatherless, which I hope will be an inducement to you to seek a father who will never fail you. Again, Edwards points to the Lord God here. As to my funeral, I would like it to be like Mr. Burr's, and any additional sum of money that might be expected to be laid out that way, I would have disposed to charitable uses. So a couple things that are kind of interesting here. First of all, the fact that Jonathan Edwards calls his relationship with his wife an uncommon union. Now, Edwards clearly had a very, very dear relationship with Sarah. And if you're interested in Sarah, I actually did a full-length lecture on Sarah Edwards just a few days ago at church here, about a 50-plus minute lecture on the life of Sarah Edwards, who has her own extremely interesting ups and downs and trials and tribulations, as well as her faithfulness to the Lord. But we also notice here that there is a reference in that previous quotation to a very simple funeral. He does not want a funeral that's very ostentatious. Apparently, he liked very much the funeral of his son-in-law, Aaron Burr Sr., and wanted his to be something like that. So those are essentially his last words. Now, remember, Sarah is not present, and so whenever she hears of the death of Jonathan Edwards, her husband, she writes this to Esther. Okay, that would be the widow of Aaron Burr Sr. She writes, "Oh, my very dear child, what shall I say? A holy and good God has covered us with a dark cloud. Oh, that we may kiss the rod and lay our hands on our mouths. The Lord has done it. He has made me adore his goodness, that we had him so long. But my God lives, and he has my heart. Oh, what a legacy my husband and your father has left us. We are all given to God, and there I am and love to be." Sarah Edwards from Stockbridge to Esther. Now, interestingly enough, that letter was never received by Esther because Esther herself died before she could read it. So if you're putting together all the data here, the Edwards family in 1757 and 1758 is virtually in free fall. Let's just review some of the facts here about what happened in these dreadful years. So President Reverend Aaron Burr Sr. dies of smallpox himself, September 1757. Then Jonathan is called to take Aaron Burr's place as the president of Princeton in February of that same year. Jonathan Edwards dies of smallpox inoculation, March 1758. Then Edwards, the widow of Aaron Burr Sr., dies of fever, leaving 2 orphans behind, her 2 children that we've already mentioned, in April of 1758. Sarah Edwards then goes to collect the 2 Burr orphans after she hears of Esther's death, but then, shockingly, Sarah herself dies just 6 months later from dysentery in October of 1758. So this is absolutely a painful and tragic death for all involved. As glorious as the life of Jonathan Edwards was, his death and the death of his wife and his daughter and her widower, certainly a series of tragic events in the Edwards family. Thankfully, their legacy lives on through his theological writings and all of his other various works. Well, if you're interested in Jonathan Edwards, I have a lot of videos on Edwards. I have a Jonathan Edwards playlist on this channel, so there's a lot of stuff there. There's lectures that I've given at seminaries and at church and other just YouTube videos like this one that I've done. Please feel free to check those things out. By the way, if you are interested in the works of Jonathan Edwards, I do have a book on Edwards, A Theology of Joy, Jonathan Edwards and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity. So there's that. Love for you to get a hold of that. By the way, it's going to come out in Audible any day now. So if you like Jonathan Edwards, you might want to check out the Audible version of this book. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for checking in. Do love you lots. And we'll talk to you later.